Welcome to Living Free in Tennessee, where we talk about building the life you choose on your terms. Today is Monday, July 1st, 2024, and this is episode 923 of Living Free in Tennessee and some Monday show. So we have all our usual Monday segments. And for those of you who just saw me on YouTube, I held up a big book called, well, what is it called? I forget. It's about art history. History of Art. It's a giant textbook, History of Art, that I'm now sitting on, so I'm tall enough for my studio. I think maybe I should get a different chair in here, but I've been sitting on this book so that I'm in the right spot. And I just thought it would be funny because I was getting the studio ready today. And I'm like, oh yeah, I got to sit on that book. And so I held it up so you could see. The History of Art has served many functions in addition to being a place where I learn stuff. It's also held up monitors, served as a piano bench boost, many other things of this nature. It's always good to have one of these around. Also, if the internet's down, I got something good to read. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, today, what are we going to talk about? Today, we are going to be talking about the 10 principles of canning that I use. And as part of the show, I will talk about how canning works. But if you're looking to learn how to do canning and don't want to just go off books, a podcast may not be the best way to learn canning. A much better way is in person. Dawn Gorham just did her annual canning class. I don't know if she's doing another one this year, just beginning canning at the Gorham Homestead. It looked like a good time. I'm pretty sure we're going to do a canning class and a cheese class here this year. As you all know, there's a little bit of fuzziness in my schedule, but it's looking like we will be doing those as well. And you can take webinars on that where people actually show you hands-on. There are great videos on YouTube about how to do it. At the end of the day, though, do it, right? So we'll talk about that. And if you have questions as we go, just put them in the comments and I'll do my best to work them in. Before we jump into the main topic, though, it's Monday. So we have our usual Monday segments, Tales from the Prepper Pantry, the weekly shopping report, a frugality tip, not from Margot this week, it's from Christy. If you have a frugality tip, by the way, send it to me, Nicole at livingfreeintennessee.com. That's how you get on the show. Anyway, we've got all those segments, and I'm going to go through those as well as thank our sponsors and all the other usual things we do on Monday. But let's start with the live stream schedule. I finally did it. I have cut the Wednesday interview show, and I know you guys love it when I interview people, and I love to interview people. And of course, I've found like 5 people I want to interview between now and then. But I'm sticking to my guns right now and preserving that time because the boost we've had on the Homestead and at Hollow Roast Coffee, because I cut that show, is pretty major. And so I'm now trying to work some interviews onto the Tuesday Live with John that I would normally do on a Wednesday show. And we'll just see how it goes. Occasionally I'll sneak in like a Spicy Sisters or something here and there, but not every Wednesday. So Tuesday, tomorrow at 9:30 in the morning, it's First Tuesday Coffee Chat with Jack Spirko and John Willis. That's going to be right here. It's going to be on the SOE, Special Operations Equipment YouTube channel, and on the Survival Podcast. We'll have a good time, I'm sure. I've got some specific questions for Jack about some shows he did, so that'll be fun. Plus, in the intervening month, a lot has happened, including a presidential debate that a lot of people have been wanting to comment on. So that'll probably come up. The other thing I have is that the Friday Homesteads Happenings class, this is really bugging me. There's a hair sticking out funny. Anyway, the Friday Homestead Happenings class episode will be at 10:30 Central Time. And that is because I'll be coming to you from California, and 9:30 Central is 7:30, and I don't think anybody in the house I will be at wants to hear me jabbering on at 7:30 in the morning. So we moved it to 8:30 Pacific while I'm doing this crazy schedule of mine where I commute to California, and we will keep it there until I'm done commuting to California, even when I'm in Tennessee on a Friday. That's the schedule for the week. Our featured event today is the Self-Reliance Festival in Camden, Tennessee. I just heard from Alan Booker today, who is the guy who did the Self-Reliant Kitchen last time. And he has proposed 2 sessions that are pretty interesting. He's definitely speaking, and he and I will go back and forth on what exactly he's doing. I've also asked him to do hands-on demonstrations from a booth so that we have more hands-on demonstrations out and about in the compound. But he proposed something more of the food sovereignty nature, where we take back control of our food through being able to raise animals, save seeds, all of those things, because there has been illegal assault on some of those issues, especially when you look at genetic, the law of seeds, well, sort of like intellectual property as relates to which seeds can be saved and reused without paying a licensing fee, right? Which is a thing. But what makes it worse is if those seeds pollinate your pure seeds and then you have their DNA in your seeds, you can get sued for that. And you did nothing, like wind and nature did something. So some of those issues, as well as how to protect your ability to grow food. He is an extremely, extremely profound, accomplished permaculturist. So this guy teaches a PDC for Paul Wheaton, and he has his own project going in his place, and he can answer all sorts of questions about just about any topic, PhD level, like super smart guy. Definitely worth coming to Self-Reliance Festival for. That's October 5 and 6 in Camden, Tennessee. And the tickets are available at selfreliancefestival.com. They are only $50 right now for the 2 days, early bird special. And also there's a sponsor who has supported us based on the number of early bird tickets we sell. They're taking that $75 price tag down to $50, which is super awesome. So check that out, selfreliancefestival.com. I also, of course, always want to thank our show sponsors. And today is John Pugliano of the Wealthsteading Podcast. John puts together really great, concise, clear podcast episodes about investing money. What a great way to learn about it. You can learn it while you're driving to and from work, earning the money that you get to invest later. Check it out at thewealthsteadingpodcast.com. Or if you go to investablewealth.com and click on podcast, you'll find it there as well. Our second sponsor of today's show is discountmylarbags.com. Guess what they do? They sell Mylar bags and other food storage solutions. The owner, Toby, knows a ton about food storage, not only from how to do so in a way that keeps food for a long time and what foods to store how, but he also has put a lot of thought to the like family size and what is an appropriate size thing to use, so that you don't like pop open a 5-gallon bucket and then discover you're one person and you have to go through this whole 5-gallon bucket of like potato flakes or something. That's over at discountmylarbags.com. And if you're interested in just learning, you don't have to go buy his stuff, but if you do, definitely use your discount code if you're a member. But he's put together some resources on the right-hand navigation to get you thinking and planning better food storage options for yourself. Plus, he has some pretty good prices on Mylar bags if you need some, and other food storage items. That's over at discountmylarbags.com. With that, it's time for our first segment of today's show, Tales from the Prepper Pantry. This is where we talk about storing what you use and using what you store. And I just, I've been thinking about the last 8 years of this podcast and how much my pantry has changed just by using those principles as my preferences, my diet, and the household has changed. I store very different things now than I did 8 years ago. I can different amounts of things. It's crazy, but this has always been a pantry segment based in seasonality. And we are in the season of refilling the pantry rather than draining the pantry. Even though I'm actually we're on closeout on a couple items in the pantry, just stuff I don't use much. And I'm thinking, don't store so many of those items. One of the things that I end up with a lot of, guys, is barbecue sauce. And that's because every time we have an event, it's like, oh, we're going to need commercial barbecue sauce for that. I should just start canning homemade barbecue sauce and just be done with it, because people use it, of course, at my events. But I'm always getting like these, I'm like, there could never be too much barbecue sauce at this event. And then I have like 6 jugs of it. And then we have another event and I use another one. And then it's a year later. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to give them really old barbecue sauce, which I know I could get away with, but whatever. So things like that just happen with your pantry. Well, with me on the road so much, my pantry method, which I have a whole webinar about, one of the things I do is really carefully document how things go from long-term storage to short-term storage to reorder and how we communicate about that. Well, with me gone, not all the communication has happened on point. And so the second backup way I have of assessing the pantry is I like to keep like items with like items and have enough space that I can kind of see, what's up. And if I need to put one more in there, there's room to put one more in there without taking everything off the shelf and putting everything back on the shelf. And I did a cruise through this week on spec because I've been out of town for events, and now I'm commuted to California, and I'm stuttering about that. And I realized that it's time to reorder toilet paper, and nobody wrote it down. And luckily, we're nowhere near, the end is not near, pun intended. It's more that I was able to go through at a glance, be like, yep, more of that. Nope, not more of that. Those things are all cool. And in a time when, I don't have a lot of time to go to stores, it's actually kind of cool to know the things in advance that we're going to need that I can order for a quick pickup instead of going into the store, or to be delivered if needed. But I'm going to do pickup because we're in town anyway this week one time. Saves me a lot of time from a shopping standpoint when I don't have to actually do the shopping. And I avoided certain catastrophe and or the need to use mullein leaves when I was out of town, because I'm pretty much the only person here who assesses that very carefully. I do get the occasional. So where the flaw in my system is we're supposed to write down when we take it from short-term to long-term to short-term storage. But usually what happens with the redneck is I get a verbal and then I write it down. So if I get a verbal and I'm not here, then I don't write it down. And that is the reality of how the family environment works at the holler. Is very rare that something gets written down like that from that particular source. And sometimes that's a battle I wouldn't fight. There's no reason to fight it. Usually it's okay. It works except for when it doesn't. And then I have a backup system because I know that it works except for when it doesn't. The other cool things going on in my pantry this week is that they're not beets I grew, but I totally scored beets at the farmer's market, which means I get to make pickled beets, which everybody who loves pickled beets loves my pickled beets. And I was a little concerned this year because the state of the beets in my garden, it said I'm going to get some, but I'm not going to get near the number I would need to can. I hope to have that one. Every year I try this, and every year I don't grow as many beets as I want, which tells me I should put more attention to that. This year I've had better luck with the ones that made it, but my watering was not under control for me being on the road when they were germinating. And so it's not as good as it could be, but at least I have beets. But I was at the farmer's market and there was one of my farmer friends there with a box of beets. And I was like, how much for the whole box? And he dumped all of them in. He's like, how much would you give me? I'm like, just throw me out of price. And he threw me out of price. And I was like, sold. And then that meant I committed myself to making pickled beets, which is not a hardship. Canning is one of the things I do that makes me feel better when I'm really stressed out. And I think it's because I have to focus on a process. There's a creative element to it. And I feel an accomplishment when I'm able to, through my own efforts, put something into the pantry that's super tangible. So canning answers all of those things. And, I love making friends with people who love growing stuff, who hate harvesting and processing it, because I like harvesting and processing it. But I also like gardening. I like harvesting and processing better. And that's actually my primary why or motivation for doing the garden. Isn't that I love growing the plants and being in nature. Sure, that's nice. I like that. But what I really love is when I'm successful and I get to harvest it and process it. I'm a little nervous on that note about green beans. I have had a green bean pest invasion that has not been going well, but I have so many seeds from Matt and Ashley that I just keep putting more seeds in. And I'm like, eventually either a predator is going to come or the wood vinegar is going to work. For the wood vinegar to work, I'm the bottleneck. I have to actually use the wood vinegar. So that's the deal. But I have some plants. I don't have as many green beans as I usually have. And we'll see how it goes. At this timeline, I'm looking more at a fall green bean harvest. And I do have 50% shade cloth out there, which is making a huge improvement on any plants that are under the shade cloth. Plus the compost we made this year, where I didn't have enough for the whole garden, but I had enough for parts of the garden. So I prioritized places where I've put that compost. Holy cow, it's been an amazing transformation. So it's good that everywhere I look, there are compost piles at my house right now, because I when Tactical and I started talking about moving the garden, I'm like, we are going to need all the compost, like to the point where I'm considering reaching out to the Marina restaurant and getting their food scraps to compost. Not just for chickens, but to compost, to make more compost. So we'll see how that goes. Meal planning has been, y'all know, if you're caught up on my podcast, that we changed our schedule last week. That's still going well. We maintained it through the weekend. I made some minor adjustments over the weekend. Like the dog walk on Saturday didn't happen at 6 a.m. because I get up and I go to the farmer's market. And I like to get there earlier so they don't run out of all the good stuff. So the dog walk just happened later in the day. But the weekend went really well. And then I got to yesterday, and like some of my productivity times on the weekend in particular are more focused on, well, getting ready for the week from a homestead or domestic standpoint. And I realized if I go into the week with everything pulled out and planned for meals, then the 4 days I'm home this week, or 3 days and a half that I'm home this week, go easily. It flows into the fourth day where Tactical cooks his own dinner. And then I need to have like a way for him to easily find food while I'm gone. Now, people ask me if he's not capable of cooking. He is more than capable of cooking. He's actually quite a good cook and managed to take care of himself for most of his life. When he's running the homestead by himself, he's doing his stuff and my stuff. And so anything I can do in advance to make it easier for him to do things that are important, like eat wholesome food that we grow, I'm going to do. And one of the things I can do with that is the meal planning. So this week I just took a pile of meat approach, and I went to the freezer and just filled up a whole bin full of meat. And I was like, this is both the food while I'm home, but also one of his meals while I'm gone is steaks. And so I pre-spice them and put them in a vacuum sealed bag that can be sous vide, so it doesn't take any of his time. He just like starts the sous vide, walks outside, does whatever, and then when he's ready to sear it off, he sears it off. But I wanted that out of the freezer, so I remembered to put it, like to get that prepped. Because if I don't, then of course he can still cook it. It just takes 6 minutes instead of 2 minutes, and sometimes that 6 minutes turns into 15 minutes. You know what I'm saying? Like it's sort of just a boost up. So I've got ham hocks this week. Those are going to be cooked tomorrow. Today we have an English roast, which is, I smoked it this morning in the smoker, and now it's in the crock pot. So I'm doing not like a medium roast. I'm doing more of a cook it low and slow with carrots with a smoke on it and garlic and onions. So that'll be easy. And then the side dish is sauteed vegetables. While I was at the farmer's market, I bought a whole bunch of vegetables, more than I could possibly eat in a week, on purpose, so that I could pre-cut them up closer to when I leave town, so that when he's cooking his own food, instead of having to cut the vegetables, it's like, okay, throw in some onions, throw in some green beans, throw in some squash, and you're done. I haven't cut them up all that way yet because I don't want them cut up turning brown until, towards the end of things. I also got the phone numbers of the farmers so that I can call them while I'm away and be like, I need this. And then I've been doing sort of my 3 o'clock meal prep walk, where I go out into the yard and the gardens, and I harvest some things from there to integrate into meals. Because my personal philosophy is, when I grow things, there's a better connection with the nutrients I need, with the plants I'm cultivating. And so I always want to build some of those in. We're having a lot of Swiss chard and greens right now. That's mostly what's coming off the garden. I'm expecting some squash blossoms when I get back, and possibly some squash. And then my first ripe tomato usually happens this week. And none of my tomatoes are ripe yet, but they're looking like they're taunting me, which means they'll probably go ripe the minute I go out of town. And that's okay. And, that's going to be like fresh tomato, basil, that sort of thing. Ken Esch was over working on a project for me last week, and I showed him my giant sage plant. And he's like, well, Carmel and I saute that up just as a side dish. So we're totally trying that this week as well. And then the way I was able to organize meals for while I'm away is, I've been home since last Monday. I started like for real cooking on Tuesday, and I've cooked more than needed for the main dish a couple of times. And so I have a freezer that's mostly empty right now. And the thing I know about people who get sort of harried and stressed out is that they don't always see things in a lot of clutter. And so I just have a dedicated shelf to meals, and it's like these are the meals you can do. Uh, so that it's super easy to pull something out and cook it. Of course, I'll pull some of it out to defrost before all of it goes. But that's all. So there's like shepherd's pie, there's meatloaf, there's a soup that I made that's like the duck beef soup from last week. I've got a steak queued up. It's been pretty easy to do that. Margot says sage tincture has helped a friend with menopause, night sweats mainly. Oh, that's good to know. You know, my symptoms of that nature have reduced greatly since I went on the Kangen water, and I'm not allowed to make a medical claim. So just this is not a medical claim. I'm sharing my personal experience, and it's been a huge relief because I was already uncomfortable before I started that, and now I'm more comfortable. So that's kind of nice. More energy, all of the things. Okay. Next up, we have the weekly shopping report from Joe. He said at Home Depot, a 2x4x8 was $3.48. The store, so that's up again, guys, from $3.25. The store was fairly busy on multiple trips in different ways. On a later trip, I picked up a small Midea window AC that I'd ordered, very efficient inverter model, cheaper than Amazon's, that you can run on solar. So that was like, I think he's planning to be able to run things on solar. So that with an inverter, that means you can do like a solar panel, but usually you can also plug into the grid, which is a nice compromise. They also had the blacktop patching stuff we needed, which they don't always have. So that's good. Aldi was busy with multiple checkout lanes going. We found everything we wanted except for cantaloupes. They were a few and didn't look good. I found a couple better ones today. Staple prices were as follows. Bread, $1.35. Eggs, $2.67, up a lot. That's up like, I think $1.75. Whole milk, $2.83. Heavy cream, $5.39. And I thought it was $5.49 last week, but I could be wrong. $3.45 for orange juice. Butter, $3.59. Bacon, $3.99. Potatoes, $4.49. Sugar, $2.99. Flour, $2.35. And 80% lean ground beef is $3.79. A gallon of untainted regular is the same at $3.59.9. Next up, we have our frugality trip. Not from Margot this week, but I'm sure she'll be back. This one's from Christy, and it's a frugality tip that's more about frugality of time than of money. Watering trees. Hubby and I spent way too much time watering new trees around our property. We found some cheap 5-gallon buckets, drilled 4 holes in the bottom using the smallest drill bit. Now to water a tree, we put the bucket beside the tree on the upside if it's on a hill and fill the bucket up and walk away. Let the bucket do the work. The water slowly drains out of the bucket into the ground to the roots where you want the water, not running off because the hose delivers water too fast. So you're saving water and time in that way. And if you want to go for extra credit, you can automate a timer or something to fill it if you have water run. And it's kind of funny because at the webinar last week with Joel Salatin, one of the things, like one of his 3 pillars of time management on the homestead is water and getting water places so you don't have to, and automating it so you don't have to spend all your time running water all over the property. And I've always known that, but like we went deeper into the topic and I started thinking about it and thinking about it at properties I don't own. And I think we're going to be making some fundamental changes around here. That's all I'm going to say about that. So great frugality tip from Christy. With that, it's time to move on to the main topic of today's show, which is 10 principles of canning. How many of you who are in the live stream already are canning your own food versus, so if you're already doing that, put a Y. How many of you have a canner that you haven't used? If you're that person, put a C for canner. And then how many of you haven't done canning at all? Put an N. I'm just curious to know from everybody who's on today where we're at just experience-wise. Okay, we've got a Y. I have an I field called out, which must be a C. I have a couple C's. Oh, a couple N's. No canner and doesn't can. Some people do can for sure. Wow, a lot of you have canners and haven't gotten to it yet. I realize that there is a bigger barrier to entry for canning than I know. And I kind of became aware of this as I was watching a discussion on one of our mastermind groups And people were talking about, oh, 114 jars in, Christy, nice. As people were talking about, I have the canner, but I just can't bring myself to do it, or I'm kind of scared, or all of those things. And that was my motivation for doing this show today. I am also, just so you know, I'll be doing, and I said it in the weekly mail that went out Monday, I will be doing some canning get-togethers that are virtual. So virtual canning sessions, particularly for those of you who've taken my canning webinars and still haven't canned, and you have all your canning equipment. And I'm not personally calling you out, Tori, but I am, you know. Um, it's not you in particular, it's you and everybody else. There are a lot of you who have like taken it, but just haven't quite pulled the trigger. And I get it. I get it. So I'm like, well, let's just all do it together. And then if you run into like a corner and need to ask a question, at least you can type your question and be like, hey, so this thing just happened. Is that normal? You know, for this show today, what I wanted to do was go out and find a video of somebody who had video of what happens to your pressure canner if you let the pressure get too high. And I'm sure they exist. And if anybody finds one, send me a link because I will keep that link. I could not find one. And so now I want to do it because I think it's very important to see what happens there, because the stories we've been told are different than the reality of what happens. And all I found was a really helpful video from, can't remember her name, Red Canning. Anyway, really good channel. And she was like, what to do if this happens, because it happened to somebody who watches her show. And that's great to know what to do if that happens. But don't you want to know like what actually happens? Because what actually happens is going to be a little anticlimactic to what you think happens based on stories from the 1940s. It's no longer 1940. It is 2024. Technology or safety on our home canners has changed a lot in that time. And we've learned a lot more about canning than we knew in 1940. Because we keep doing it and we keep learning more, and people are always doing research and those sorts of things. Like, it's a big thing. So the 10 principles of, originally I was just going to talk through how to do canning because a lot of people are coming into my show new and haven't started canning. And we will, I'm sure I will talk about how the canning process works. I know under which principle I will do that. But that's not the point. The point is, what are your principles of canning and how does it work into your life? I'm seeing Digger here says, I used to can, but health got in the way, working my way back in. Yeah. How do you balance canning, the food you grow or the food you score for cheap in season, with having a life? That's something that you might want to talk about, because it could take all your time to can and then you could be miserable, but why make yourself miserable? And so I have some of my own principles of canning. Oh, here's a good one. I pressure canned ground beef a year ago and now I'm afraid to eat it. Canned broth, and I'm fine with eating that. Just can't get past the whole meat thing. Man, I don't know what to tell you to get you past that, because it's no different than the broth. It's no different than green beans. I will tell you that for sure, boil that on the way back out of the jar. That's your hedge. So I don't know if it's a consistency of meat thing or that it's a low acid food, but we eat many low acid canned foods. So get you a pot out and make you a stew, a beef stew, and then make sure you've boiled it, for whatever time you deem is the right amount of time, having looked into why you need to boil it, and try it. Because you're going to have, it's going to be interesting what you discover about the flavor. I know that I prefer to make chicken soup from canned chicken, like bone-in canned chicken that I've done, to just making it on the stovetop, even to just doing it in the pressure cooker which should be the same as canned. I don't know why. I don't know if it's like it sat on the shelf for 6 months and then like all the flavors came out better, or I don't know what it is, but it makes more chicken stew than like actual chicken fresh, which is an interesting discovery to have made. So it's mainly because it just looks weird in the jar. Yeah. Make yourself a nice beef stew. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Stop looking at the jar. Anyway, so these are my 10 principles of canning, and I will talk about things along the way. I have, like some Monday shows, I kind of ignore the chat. I see today more as a discussion because you're here because you saw the topic. And if you have something that adds to the discussion, feel free to put it in. It does help me know that you want me to see it if you put the first couple words in all capital letters, though. So that's just a pro tip for y'all. So principle number 1, this is the most important principle. Be fearless. Be fearless. But not too fearless. It's a balance. So be fearless, but not too fearless. And by which I mean, if you haven't started because you're afraid of the pressure canner, learn how, make sure you've read your manual for how it works, and just pressure can something. Go through the process. Even if you just do water the first time with no jars in there, like go through the process, see how it works. To truly homestead, you have to be willing to try things that might fail. And sometimes when we're canning things, they fail, and we notice that they fail, and we adhere to principle number 8, which you'll learn what that is when we see that there's been a failure. Oh, well, unless it can be salvaged. Some failures can be, they're not really failures. Like it's like, okay, we can do this to fix that. So be fearless, but not too fearless. And that's because home canned food, if handled incorrectly, can be dangerous. It can make you sick, and you don't want to get sick, which is why we need principle number 2, know the why. A lot of classes that I've seen with canning talk about how to can safely. They walk you through step by step. I mean, it's a scientific process. If you just follow it every time, you're fine, right? Well, yeah. But if you know why each step exists, then it's easier to remember all the steps, because then it's just like, oh, I see how this fits together. I see why this is a thing. But also, when something, like when your action is truly necessary, because it does happen to all of us that we are following a recipe, we skip a step. And if skipping the step was something like you didn't add a 1/4 teaspoon of salt to your green beans, and you don't know why you need the salt in your green beans, then you don't know the answer to the question, is it safe to eat the green beans? And the answer to the question is yes, it's safe to eat the green beans. The salt is not part of the preservation process of green beans when you're just doing pressure canned green beans. What it does is change the flavor. Well, that same salt, when used in quick pickles, is part of the preservation process, and it's a ratio that I wouldn't mess with. I absolutely would not mess with that, because in the process of pickling a cucumber, you're changing the pH from basic to acidic with the vinegar, and the salt adds flavor, but salt is also a preservation method. So what it does is it inhibits the capacity for bad bacteria to grow, right? So I wouldn't mess with that. So know the why, and then be willing to why your why, and be willing to, even after 17 or 18 years of doing home canning, that's me, be wrong. If somebody says, Nicole, that thing you said about canning and botulism is incorrect, I would 100% go look at it to see if they were right. Because A, there might be new information I don't know. B, I may have misunderstood something that I researched. So that may feel really overwhelming to know the why, but if you just hit one why at a time, you're fine. And if you follow the recipe, you can be fearless, but you're not being too fearless, right? You're not just, oh, I canned some pickles, so now I'm going to throw green beans in the jar and process them for the same time without looking up the time. Don't do that. That's too fearless. That's actually super dangerous. And there's a difference between being fearless and being stupid, or being fearless and being dangerous, right? And so that brings us to principle number 3. This one is going to be controversial. If you want to get into a fight on the internet, one really fast way to do this is go into any canning group and make this statement, or any statement of any kind. The USDA tested recipes really are safer. There's a lot of resistance to using the USDA tested recipes for canning. And what the USDA did to develop those recipes was use a laboratory with probes when processing specific recipes to find out if, based on the pH of the food, the temperature got high enough for long enough to not only kill all of the things that make us vomit or have diarrhea, that sort of thing, if we don't have it killed and it grows wrong, but also to eradicate, whatever the word is, the botulism spore. And the botulism spore is not our friend. We'll talk about that a little bit later. That's the most important thing to keep out of your canned goods. And there are several ways to do that. We will talk about them later. So because of that, the recipes they've created are based on the lab tests. And there's a margin of error built into it for people who don't know what a rolling boil looks like, a little bit of variation in pressure gauges, like all of the things that could happen that take that away, right? They have built in not just exactly the amount of time for a recipe, but more time. They also have talked about what size to cut the bits of food up in your jars, how much headspace to leave in the jars, all of these things to take much of the mystery away from processing your food. So then rebel canners come along and they're mad because they have other recipes from before the USDA did all of this that have different practices for canning. And they're like, well, it's worked. And it's like, no, the why. Go back to principle 2. Why did it work? Did it work because you were lucky? Which can like the instance of getting botulism spores in your jars to begin with is fairly low if you handle your food right. So that's one. So low probability. Or is it because of how botulism works when the stuff comes out of the jar? And is it a difference between how you're cooking the food after you take it out of the jar versus the other? Which still brings me back to the USDA tested recipes are safer because they stopped that problem before it happens, not after it happened. And stopping that problem before it happens is a really good idea. It's better than like throwing myself onto the mercy of fixing the problem after it's happened. Because if you've ever looked into botulism, you'll see it doesn't take very much to be a big problem in your life. And you're learning how to walk and talk and all of these things again. And because I'm not in an end of world scenario without a pressure canner starving, and the only way we keep people alive is by using older methods, why take the risk? So that will probably not make some people happy listening to me happy, and I don't care. I will say personally, I have assessed the why and the risk, and I used USDA recipes and times and procedures, and sometimes for some things that only I'm going to consume, I apply the knowledge of the one to something that's not a specific recipe from the USDA, particularly with soups and stews. That's a decision I've made for myself after balancing the risks, okay? But what I don't do is make up processing times for green beans and put them in the oven instead of a proper canner because you can turn the oven up to 350 degrees. This is where understanding the science is really cool. People say you can bake green beans in your oven because it's 350 degrees in your oven and it will kill the botulism spore, and that's as good as canning. But the problem with that is when you can green beans, they are in water in the jar, and water boils at 212 degrees at sea level, and then it turns into steam. And so the temperature doesn't go higher. It goes away. And 212 doesn't kill botulism. So when somebody proposes an alternative plan like that, it's very important to go back and know the why. Likewise, a steam canner versus a water bath canner, which will totally come up, for high acid foods. High acid foods, botulism can't grow in. So we'll start there. High acid foods, what you're getting rid of is all the other nasties that could grow mold, that would be visible, that you could smell, that'll make you have, poop issues and all sorts of stuff, but not going to kill you. Well, it might, but it probably won't kill you. It'll probably just make you feel really bad. Okay. Plus, you'll probably see it's a problem before you actually eat the food. So there's that. So high acid foods can be canned in a steam canner, people say, which is not the approved method, which water bath canning is, right? Wait, what's the purpose of water bath canning? What's it doing? It's you're covering jars with water so no bacteria from the air can get like into it on accident. You're boiling it so the inside temperature is up to a certain amount while it's under cover, and then when you turn everything off and it cools down, that lid sucks down, it creates a vacuum. That's what's happening. Well, a steam canner actually is not unapproved by the USDA, I don't think. Like, they are approved. It's kind of the same environment because you have a sealed thing, like container or pot where the steam is. And that's the same thing. Like, bacteria can't get in through the steam to your jar. So sometimes those things, when you start thinking about them, make sense and work, and sometimes they don't. Another one is pressure canning retort canners. Like home retort canning is not approved by the USDA. And the reason it isn't is they don't have any testing for it. And well, they've started doing testing, but a retort canning is in a vacuum sealed package. You pressure can low acid foods. And then you can take, it's like something I could take easily on, not on, well, I could check it in my bag on the airplane, but I could take it easily in a backpack and eat that food. And it would be better than carrying a breakable jar on a backpack trip. Well, the theory works, right? You put a quart of beans in a quart size retort bag, you pressure can it for the same amount of time as a quart jar, and that should work, except if you stack 8 retort bags next to each other and it's way thicker than a mason jar, then the center one isn't getting hot enough. And so what people have done for home retort canning is they've created devices that keep them from touching each other, right? So then when I think about that and I think about, know the why, then I can make my own decision about risk analysis. Am I willing to consume and or create retort canned things? I'm not going to tell you the decision I've made on that one, but you can make your own decision. You can look into it. So the USDA tested recipes are for sure safer because they're for sure tested for that specific thing. But back to principle 2, knowing the why helps you understand when it's probably okay to take the risk and not go with it versus when you should absolutely USDA. And if you're really freaked out by canning, then you should 100% of the time stick to the USDA procedures, which you can get a lot of those at the National Center for Home Canning. And it will, hold on a second. It has almost everything you'd ever need to know about canning. It not only tells you times, but it also tells you things that, how to process it, all of those things. And I think it's super helpful. So I'm actually looking for a reference I want to show you, and it's not coming up super easily, and I don't know why. I'm going to try this. Well, anyway, we'll get to that. So next, principle number 4, fresh is best. Fresh is absolutely best. You know why fresh is best? Because the fresher your food, the less time it's had to start going bad, which means the less likely it is to have the kind of bacteria that you need to kill in your canned food. 2, it also helps keep the food nicer looking in the jar, basically. And the freshest, best vegetables are the ones you should process, not the ones that look sorry, right? I mean, likewise with meat, you can keep it in your freezer and then can it, and that's fine as a way to extend the storage a little bit more. But better is, if you know you're going to have to can the meat you bought, have a plan to get that done sooner rather than later, because I'd rather can my meat fresher. at that point if I can. But that doesn't mean that you can't, take that ground beef that's been in there a year and pressure can it if you want to, if you feel like I need more freezer space. It does begs the question, what do you need to do meal planning wise to keep that on rotation? Like, why is it still there? That's always a good question. Sometimes it's there because you processed all your pigs on the same weekend and you ended up with a whole boatload of pork you could not eat all of. Because that's why we're having ham hocks this week. We're having 3 of them because I found 3 more. And I'm like, man, you guys have been in here a while and we got to use you up for sure. So fresh is best. When you're choosing produce, get it as fresh as you can and then commit to processing it soon. So an example of this would be you go to the farmer's market on Saturday and there's green beans that they picked the night before and you want to can those. You take them home. If you can start it that afternoon, you start it that afternoon. If not, you can do it the next day. That's fine. Keep them in the fridge. Do the best you can. Like my ideal schedule for green beans is I pick them at night on a Friday. I can them Saturday morning. Because I have found getting up early to pick the beans and then can them that day is not the schedule that I'm good at keeping. I'll get done picking them. I'll wash them and I'll be like in the afternoon under the slog of canning miserable, which is not why I do this. And it violates principle 10. So that's very important. 5, don't can things you don't like. I'm looking at you, person who grew too many radishes in your garden and then decided to pickle them and make pickled radishes that you also don't like. You broke that principle on gardening. Don't grow things you don't like. And then you made it worse by preserving them and putting them on your shelf that you're never going to eat. The only reason to ever can something you don't like is because somebody in your house likes it or you can give it away. Right? Like I don't love strawberry jam, but I would, if I had strawberries and Christmas was coming, I would totally can strawberry jam. Why not? Right? I just know that the intention is not for me. It's not for me. So it's just a very common thing we do when we have surplus, right? Is we want to make sure we don't waste it. Amy's like, yeah, I've done it. Everybody's made that mistake. And sometimes you can things and you thought you were going to like it and you don't like it. And then you keep the jars of this stuff in your pantry for 4 years before you admit you're never going to eat it. It's okay to admit way sooner than that you're not going to eat the thing you don't like. Like some people don't like quick pickles because they're not crispy enough. Even by adding, the tannins back in with grape leaves or whatever and cutting off the blossom end. Very important you do that if you want crisper pickles. They end up with pickles that are too squishy for them. And they're not as crisp as the ones on the store because they're never going to be. They're never going to be if you've canned them properly. And so they just don't like it. They're like, they taste okay, but I don't want to eat them. Okay, don't eat them. Feed them to your chickens, whatever. Get rid of them. Compost them. There's all these other things you can do. And then, never make quick pickles again. It's okay to learn that. That's back to be fearless. Principle number 1. You might as well try it. And then if you don't like it, go on with life. It's okay. Some people can green beans and don't like the mouthfeel because it's not al dente. Canned green beans are squishy. I like squishy green beans. I can my green beans. I like the fresh al dente ones too if they're cooked right, but I really like squishy green beans with lots of butter and flavors or curry or whatever. Love it. I don't know why. Delicious. Maybe it's because I grew up on it, so it's a thing I learned. I like them and other people don't. And if you're on the don't list, you should totally blanch those things and freeze them because you can totally get al dente green beans by doing that. And it's still food preservation, right? It's okay. As long as you have electricity, you have a freezer you can do. Amy says, pickled radishes lose the hot heat, retain the crunch, and the brine turns pink. So Amy likes them. Amy, you should keep pickling your radishes. I actually love radishes and I love pickled radishes, but I just know so many people who have done that and then they're like, meh. I pickled cucamelons, which are like these, or mouse melons, like these tiny cucumbers. And I saved this one jar of tiny little cucumbers to serve on a charcuterie platter for Christmas Eve proudly. And I put it out and they tasted horrible. Now, I know other people who pickle them and they taste good, so I should probably try somebody else's recipe because I actually like pickled stuff, but they were okay. They didn't make me want to retch in my mouth, but I was like, man, I carefully saved this jar just for this one special day. And I haven't pickled cucamelon since then. We'll just put it that way. I've totally done cucumbers, pickling cucumbers, but yeah, not cucamelons. Pickled squash, like pickled summer squash, really delicious. I did watermelon rinds once, and what I learned from that is that if you don't cut off the green part of the rind, so you're just kind of doing the white flesh, it was very unchewable in my case. So Amy says, did you poke them to get the brine internalized? No, but I've never done that with pickles. So I'll try that. I'll try that. Next time I get my hands on some, I'm not growing them this year. I usually do grow them because I guess I still could. It's early enough in the season. But yeah, I haven't tried that. It wasn't really that, I don't know. It just was a weird flavor. So that's probably what I did wrong. I'll totally try that with the cucamelons. Okay. So don't can things you don't like. And when you do can things that you end up not liking, don't can them again. And to this, I'm going to say back to rule number 3, that the USDA tested recipes really are safer. They have specific spaghetti sauce recipes that you use that, depending on what you add to your spaghetti sauce, would change the pH of your spaghetti sauce, and that would actually impact the canning time, which is why they say just use our spaghetti sauce recipe. And their spaghetti sauce recipe is edible, but not what I want for spaghetti sauce. So what I have done is I just can tomato sauce. And then I make spaghetti sauce when I want spaghetti sauce from the tomato sauce. And if I want to use it to thicken a stew and make it taste richer, I do that. And if I want to make salsa with it, I do that. And if I want to turn it into ketchup, I do that. So I have a tendency to can more of the single raw ingredients, except for if I'm doing a chutney, a relish, or a salsa, something of that nature. And I do can and preserve soups, so that it's just quick boil out of the jar. For if I'm sick and somebody's helping, I'll do that too. But I don't keep very much of that sort of pre-made stuff because I can make whatever I want when I cook. And the recipes that are USDA approved are boring. Let's just be honest. They're boring. So why do that to yourself? You can, like, spaghetti sauce is so very easy. Yeah. Tuck by V says, so don't can black jelly beans. Yeah, don't can jelly beans anyway. They'll last a long time on their own because it's sugar, and sugar just lasts a long time unless the ants get to it. But you can totally mail me all your black jelly beans because I love that black licorice flavor. It's a thing that people either like that or hate it. Principle number 6, embrace botulism basics. So this paired with be fearless is very important. Go out and read the horror stories that are botulism poisoning and what happens to you when that happens, to understand the risks. Go learn how much of the toxin is required for your nerves to be affected, because the answer is not very much. Go learn that it is smellless and sightless. Go learn where it most often lives. Go learn why, even though it lives in the dirt, if you eat dirt, you don't get botulism, because there's a why in your digestive tract. And then understand how it works. So the spore will not wake up and have a party and create the toxin unless it is in an oxygen-free environment that is moist. And everybody loves that word. So a jar of green beans is oxygen-free and moist. Now, there's another thing that has to happen. The pH has to be above 4.6, something like that. 4.4, somewhere in that range. When I get anywhere near that range with the pH, I just consider it low acid and then take appropriate steps. But the deal is this: a high acid environment, which means a lower pH, the spore won't wake up. It's not that the spore is dead. It's that the spore will not wake up, have a party, and create a toxin that can attack your nerves. So that's important to know. That means when you're making jams and jellies, they're high acid usually. Your fruits are high acid, like peaches, pears, plums. Canned plums suck, by the way. Blackberries. Tomatoes are on the edge. Tomatoes, when you can them, you're supposed to add citric acid or vinegar or lemon juice to make sure the pH is correct. Or you could get a commercial pH tester if you want to know the why and understand how botulism works and still have safe food. And green beans and cucumbers are not. They're low acid. But when you add the vinegar brine to a cucumber and turn it into a pickle, it becomes high acid because vinegar is acid. Well, then when you see these memes talking about how awful it is because some of the vinegar on the market is not your typical 5% vinegar or whatever, it's like it's a higher percentage. Let me go look actually specifically because there's a reason that it is. So people think it's because they're trying to screw you over, and it isn't. It's because vinegars that you use for salad dressing will have a different percentage of vinegar to water, basically. So, but most vinegars at the store, like white vinegar, is the proper percentage of vinegar, and that means that a lot of people use that for salad dressing too. And the answer is that the acidity level is 5% for canning. And if you buy one for salad dressing, it'll be like a different percentage, right? Lower acidity. So it'll be like 4%, maybe. That's a lower acidity level. Now, if you've accidentally done that, we actually figured out the math on it. And to have the same acidity level, you add less water to your brine because in essence, what has happened is the vinegar has more water in it. So it's at a lower acid level. So we did figure out what to do if you do that. But when you're at the store buying the thing, then just look at the label and make sure it's 5% because that's sort of the standard that we do for that. So anything with acid, botulism spores are not going to wake up. Anything lower acid, they can, and therefore we pressure can them. Unless we're changing their pH, like in the case of a pickle, right? So we pressure can them, and that is so boiling point of water is what at sea level, 212. That actually makes it so the boiling point is higher under pressure, and then you get a higher temperature. That's why we use pressure canners for low acid foods, my friends. And because of that, it kills the botulism spore. But I think it brings your food up to 240-ish degrees. And it might be 242, whatever. Just don't quote me on that number right now. It's because I know the why, but I did not write all the numbers down. When I do my class, I actually tell you the numbers. But I have to always double look at the numbers because numbers escape me sometimes. So I always like, also every time I'm looking at canning recipes or I'm canning for the first time, something for the first time this year, green beans will be my next one. I'm like, I think the processing time is 25 minutes at 11. And I go look at the recipe and I'm like, yep, or nope, good thing I looked, right? So I always double check when it's the first time because sometimes my numbers like reverse themselves in my head, which is not what you want to do when you're canning, right? So it raises it up, but it raises it up in a home canner to a temperature that's right there on the border of eradicating the spore. And it is possible that very accidentally, in a very, like it would be a fluke, one of them, for whatever reason, hung out, and then it woke up and had a party and put the toxin in the jar. Which is why when you're using the food, like I said earlier about the meat that needs to be made into a stew, it's why I suggested a stew. You need to boil it because the toxin, when boiled, it's like, I think it's around 185 degrees, breaks into its base elements and stops being that nerve toxin, so it won't kill you. So why then, if I understand how botulism works, I need to be fearless. Why wouldn't I just screw it, do whatever I want, and then on the way out of the jar, boil it so I don't, whatever. Couple reasons. One, if for some reason the toxin was in the jar, and there was a lot of it because I didn't do any safe practices, and I touched it and touched things around my kitchen or licked my fingers or whatever, that means somebody else could come by later and still accidentally consume the toxin. And it really does not take very much of the botulism toxin to mess with you. That's one reason. The second reason is, do you know you got it all in the boil? If you've really minimized the chance it's even there, and there's probably not very much of it is, and then you boiled it, and you can look up times for that on your own by learning how botulism works. Then you don't, like have as much that you would need to get rid of. So for me, it's a hedge. And the reason I, who say be fearless, am willing to be that careful about something is I read a lot about it and I learned what it's like if you get nailed by it and don't die to just recover. And I decided that in this case, the negative is so large if I mess up that I'm not willing to be fearless about that. So we boil all low pressure, like low acid foods here before we eat them, no matter what, including bone broth, including soups and stews, including vegetables like corn and, squash and like any of those things. Meats, we boil them. I haven't done seafood, but I would boil it if I did seafood. My grandfather and my grandmother used to can tuna fish every year. And they'd give us jars and be like, boil this before you use it. And I thought what you had to do was put it in the jar in a boil and boil it that way, which you can totally do. But for most of the things I just pour it in the pot and boil it. And boiling in the crock pot, because I used to think that'd be good enough, not good enough. It's not a rolling boil unless you have a very special crock pot, which not all of us have. So I do it on the stove, then put it in the crock pot if I'm doing like a crock pot stew and adding home canned green beans. I'll just boil the green beans, and if I'm putting some home canned stock in the soup as well, I put that in with the green beans. I boil it, and then I put it in the crock pot, and I boil it for a set amount of time that I have personally chosen to do based on a phone call with a laboratory in Knoxville. So that's principle number 6. That's a very important one. And I see Josie's like, great timing. I've been volunteering on a farm surrounded by 5-gallon boxes of produce to preserve. Yep, there's all the produce to preserve. Amy says, I canned so many jars of tomato products last year. I'm clearly not remembering if I added acid. Yeah, good question. You probably did if you were following a recipe. And it's possible you didn't if you weren't. And the thing about tomatoes is you are like the official rule is add acid. And what I do is I take the pH to see if it's in the proper range. And all my tomatoes always have been. Like I haven't had to add acid. If I don't have the pH tester handy, I will add acid just to be safe. Is this the best practice for commercially canned goods as well? Okay, so the difference with commercially canned goods is they bring it to a higher temperature, so it's less likely that botulism will be in there. And however, if you look at the CDC's site and look at the cases of botulism from food, you will notice that some have come in recent years from a fish packing factory. So I don't actually worry about it. I actually don't eat very many commercially canned foods, but do pay attention to recalls and know the symptoms of botulism, because if you do have it, then that would be bad. But like all in all, it's a super rare thing to have happen, no, even from home canned or from commercially canned food. But when it happens in commercially canned food, it's going to have a bigger impact because more volume has come out of there. Like when you're looking at the home scale, it's like, well, I did, 12 jars of green beans and it impacted 3 people, as opposed to a cannery, which is sending out, hundreds of thousands of cans of seafood. So yeah. Solstice Girl says, I'll be boiling. Thank you for the information on boiling to break down the toxin. Yeah. Most people don't teach that in their canning class. Like I went to a class that was put on by an extension office, and I was like, why didn't you teach people to boil their low acid foods on the way out of the jar? Why would I do that? And I'm like, because this is how botulism works, and this is like literally what I was taught growing up. It was just like, this is how it works, and then I had to learn why it worked that way as an adult. So I keep looking over at my window because there's a yellow finch looking in at me. He's really cute. Or golden finch, I guess is what they're called. Yeah. So, and then they added it. They're like, actually, that makes sense. Rule number 7, don't guess. I can't tell you how many phone calls I've gotten from people who just decided to guess. Things like, well, I got done canning my tomato sauce and I put flour in it to thicken it. Do you think it's safe, Nicole? I'm like, why did you keep going? When you realized you weren't supposed to add flour to it, why did you keep going? What do you think flour does to it? It thickens it, which changes the amount of time it's going to take for the temperature to get to the center of that jar. I'm sure it impacts the pH. Like there's all sorts of things. Like if you're canning soups, you don't put pasta in them. You don't no flour, no pasta, none of that. Not even supposed to have dairy in there. So if you have recipes like that, if you're going to get around it, you just put the pasta in when you actually use it on the way out of the jar. You know what? Pasta stores real well dry too. If you can the pasta, it's going to fall apart and be like super gecky. So that's sort of a thing. So don't guess. If you don't know something, it's better to abort the process and go find out about it. And if there's no good answer, start asking people until you know. And if it's something that you're like, I really need to preserve this and I can't find out how to preserve pumpkin, for example, preserve it a different way. Like freeze it, mash it up, freeze it, done. But don't guess. Guessing gets you in trouble. That's like the one like really big case of botulism poisoning that I learned about recently was a woman who had learned how to can high acid foods and she put green beans in her water bath canner for 20 minutes. She's guessed at the time, just oh, cool. And they sealed and they looked beautiful. And then she fed them to her family and she ate them. And she was the only one who got the poisoning, but she was in the ICU for over a month, like breathing for you sort of thing. Because her nerves, what it did is her body the nerves stopped working. And so you can't breathe because you can't move your muscles. So they have to do it for you. That's how they get you through it. They give you support. Like, anyway, don't guess. Okay. We've hammered all the scary stuff enough today, haven't we? Oh, no, we haven't. Principle number 8 is when in doubt, throw it out. If you look at the jar and you're like, it's been 2 years and it's fuzzy, should I eat it? The answer is no. If you're asking the question, it's no. If you look at a jar and there's some discoloration after 2 years, but it was canned properly and it's clear the seal's been fine, like for the person who has Solstice Girl who has some meat, like over time it will get a different color as it sits on the shelf. That's probably fine. Depends on how long it's been there. Like if it's gonna be palatable. But when in doubt, throw it out. But ask questions. Like if you had some siphoning when you were canning and the headspace is higher than it should be because some of the liquid came out, that's still okay to eat. You just want to use it up first. That usually happens for one of 3 reasons. 1, you crank down the lid too much. 2, you were supposed to have an inch of headspace and you went just a little more than like it was 3/4 of an inch instead of an inch. And then the third reason is that you took the jar out into a cool air environment before it had cooled down enough. So when it's super hot and you take it out of your pressure canner, you'll see siphoning. Happens really easily with bone broth. And you just have to decide if you're okay with some siphoning or if you're going to let it cool down and you don't get to use the canner until it's cooled down more. But there are times, like with that question, hey, I added flour to my sauce and then stored it for 2 months. Should I eat it? The answer is no. Sometimes I used to be really snarky and be like, well, if you want to possibly kill your family, eat that. If you walked out of the room and you came in, your pressure canner gauge went down below 11 or whatever, you got to start your time over again. But Nicole, do I really need to? Because it was like almost done. I'm like, yeah. Now the chances of that happening are low because usually what happens with a pressure canner is as the process goes on, you have to keep turning down the heat because it keeps getting higher and higher pressure on the stovetop one. But when in doubt, throw it out. Okay. Principle number 9. This is the mistake I made my first year of having canned goods. And that is eat what you most want to eat first. I kept saving my stuff for the future because I wanted to have really good stuff in the future. 2 years later, I still had stuff that I was saving for the future that I did not eat. You know what happens to canned goods that sit on your cool, dark shelf, which is how you're supposed to Store them. Not one that freezes, though. Otherwise, you'll break your jars. Do you know what happens to it after 2 years? Everything starts moving closer to brown in color. The flavor is not as good. It gets squishier instead of, like consistency changes. It's not as good. So unless you're like saving that one jar of cucamelons for Christmas or whatever, or you've got a schedule figured out where you're like, I can have 2 spaghetti sauces a week, whatever. If what you most want are your pickled beets, pop a can of those pickled beets today. Eat them up. Your biggest success in canning is if you do what I say in the Prepper Pantry segment, which is can what you eat and eat what you can. The second part of that's really important. Actually eat what you can. Because just admiring it on a shelf, while it might make you feel emotionally good, is not helping you decrease your bill at the grocery store. It's not helping you access the nutrition that you've put in that jar by sourcing really good food in season. It's not helping you with anything. It's just sitting there looking pretty and making you feel good. Well, maybe that's something, right? But you might as well eat what you most want to eat first. And that's something I got from my friend Dixie Jessica Mills. Dixie Homemade Wanderlust is her channel, really good channel. She's a hiker. And she said, I always eat what I most want from my bag because, you have your food with you on your backpack because I get to eat what I most want every day that way. And I don't end up at the end of my hike with this really special thing that I wanted that I never ate. And I was like, man, I could have enjoyed that while I was out, on a hike. The same goes for your home canned foods. And you'll find in your family that everybody wants the peaches or everybody wants the pears or everybody wants something. That helps you know if you need to can more of it, first of all. But also, everybody got to eat all of what they wanted first. And that's kind of a fun way to live your life, which brings me to principle number 10, the last principle of today's show. Have fun. I told you the story of how I really did not set myself up for success with green beans, where I would get up in the morning, I would harvest the green beans. And at the time of year when green beans are coming on in Tennessee, it's a little hot out. And I would spend, in the early morning. So it's like I had to get up early, which at the time, I wasn't like just getting up early all the time anyway. So the reason I did that is then it wasn't as hot because if you harvest vegetables when it's in the heat of the day, then they don't they wilt more. It's not great. So then I would harvest them and then I'd need to wash them. And then by that time I'm tired and I have a cup of coffee and like it's time to eat breakfast and other things happen. And you like soak them in water to make sure they're all cleaned off because botulism spores live in soil. And if the soil's on your beans, you don't want the soil on your beans because that increases the chance that one of those little nasties gets in your jar, right? So there's all of those things. And then I finished breakfast and did the dishes. And then it was time to start snapping the beans. So with beans, it's really interesting because they used to say you have to have 1-inch pieces of beans. And now like that's sort of changed where you can have bigger chunks. But I like to snap beans because even though they tell me that they are stringless on the package, sometimes you get a stray seed where you do have strings. And if you can your green beans with strings and then try to eat them, you end up with mouthfuls of stuff you can't swallow that you have to spit out like hair. It's like having a giant hairball in your canned green beans. That's an ask me how I know story. I did that. And the way I did that is I was cutting them instead of snapping them and it just cut right through the strings. And they told me they were stringless beans and they were not stringless beans. And it was horrible. And I did actually eat all of those and spit out hairballs as I was going because I wanted to use them. But it was not pleasant. But I mean, it tasted good, but it was not a pleasant experience. So by the time I get to 2 in the afternoon, I'd be exhausted. I'd be stressed out because I still had to process these things. It was time to start thinking about cooking dinner. And then I was going to have to do all that. And it just wasn't fun. And then I realized by making a simple change, I could pick the beans the night before, put them in the fridge, get up in the morning, do morning things, soak them in water while I was doing morning things, and have everything banged out. Or if I was feeling jiggy that night, I might snap them on the sofa while watching a show and then process them first thing in the morning. I made it more fun. Another way to make it fun is to have friends over to help you. I love having friends over to help me because then it's more of a social event. That's like, I call that canning palooza. Like, let's just hit it hard today. We'll play some music, have some cocktails at the end of the day. We'll plan a meal that does not require my kitchen by using the outside smoker. Good things come from the outside smoker. And then you just have a good time and everybody goes home with some canned stuff. That's where community can really be nice if you have people nearby who are like-minded. So having fun's the most important part of this, because you know what? It's fun to learn a new skill. It's fun to build this into your life. You could decide, you know what? I don't like canned green beans. I'll never can them again. I'm always going to blanch them and freeze them. But you know what I do like is having all of my own home canned tomato sauce, which is one of my things. I, after tasting what home canned tomato sauce was like, completely embraced that I preferred that flavor over what comes from a jar or a can at the store. And so every year where I'm in a situation where I gotta buy the can of store stuff, that means I failed. It means I failed. So it's more fun for me to have the tomato sauce that I made myself. So now I just grow more tomatoes, right? This is same with the home canned salsa. Like every time I get stuck with store salsa, I'm like, yep, they put sugar in that. I don't like sugar in my salsa. It's the same with spaghetti sauce. They put sugar in that. I don't like sugar in my spaghetti sauce. Other people do. That's fine. But I don't. And as you get further into it, it can be so fun. And it can also really help reduce your costs at the grocery store. But be aware, sometimes it's more. My canned green beans, I think, if I buy them at the farmer's market, it's about $2 a jar. It might be $3 this year because inflation happened. My canned tomatoes are not that much because I don't buy seeds. I bought $5 worth of seeds this year. If I get 120 pounds, I'll probably get 24 jars of salsa. So it's pennies per jar for ingredient, but there is my time involved in that. But for me, that's actually one of my piece out sort of things I do is like tend my tomatoes. So, some things make more sense than others, and you can put a lot of money into growing things, or you can put a lot of money, like you could buy $7 a pound tomatoes and then your salsa is going to be more expensive. So you have to decide what your purpose is. My purpose is more nutrition, better flavor. That's it. Like the cost savings have just been a thing that I've noticed happens along the way on some things, but not all things. But man, the lifestyle difference has been amazing. So that's all of my thoughts. Those are the 10 principles of canning. If you like the show and want to support the work I'm doing here, you can do it in 2 ways. 1, get your coffee at hollowroast.com. 2, consider becoming a member. Head over to livingfreeintennessee.com to find out more. With that, guys, go out, make it a great week.